friends, you know when we start a video standing here in front of my bookshelves, it's usually because we're picking out some books for a reading vlog. And the books that we are going to be picking out and reading in this video are the books that Booktubers favorites recently made me buy. So the first book that I picked up was on the recommendation of the lovely Angela over at Literature Science Alliance. There was a book that she spoke about several times last year. Glowing praise she was giving this book. And that book was Aboreality by Rebecca Campbell. This is a very short book, but Angela's recommendations have convinced me that it's gonna pack a punch. And from what I understand, it's near future climate fiction with a bunch of kind of like interweaving stories. Next up we have, I suppose, what you'd call a classic fantasy. It's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but Leanna, like honestly, she just waxed lyrical about this book. And that is Lud-In-The-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. I don't know a lot about it other than the fact that it's pre-Tolkien fantasy. I think it was published in the 1920s. And I must confess that I have never read any Tolkien. I think the furthest I go back in terms of classic fantasy would be one of Le Guin's books. So this is definitely going to be quite a different experience for me. But I was intrigued and I wanted to give it a try. Then you know I'm going to take any excuse to throw in a graphic novel. And I was so thrilled when I saw Paperback Stacks talking about a graphic novel that just sounded so interesting and thought-provoking. And that is M is for Monster by Talia Dutton. And my understanding of this is it's kind of like a queer take on Frankenstein. We have two sisters, one of whom has passed away, and the other one is trying to essentially resurrect her, but it doesn't quite go to plan. I think what really sold me on this was when Lillian was talking about the really strong queer themes, and especially around perhaps like an allegory for trans identity, or more generally not being accepted for who you are and external pressures to be somebody that you're not. So it honestly just sounds quite clever and moving, and I can't wait. Next up we have a book that one of my favorite booktubers, Sunny, recommended, and this is like a literary satire which did intrigue me, but I'm not gonna lie to you, it was the cover that did it, and that is The Very Nice Box. Look at this cover! There is a paperback version of this book with an entirely different cover, which is the book that's largely in circulation in Australia, but I went out of my way to find a secondhand copy of the hardback just so I could have this cover. And I remember Sunny talking about this as a satire on millennial and corporate culture. She did mention that there's some exploration around queer identity, quite a bit about grief, but she says it gets bonkers by the end. So this might just be the book that I'm most looking forward to in this video. Next we have two horror books that I was convinced to read because each showed up in two of my favorite booktubers favorites videos. Horror is honestly a genre I haven't read a lot of. I think I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat, I'm not gonna lie, but I have just found myself, especially over the last 6 months or so, being curious about maybe just dabbling in the genre a little bit. And so when these two books came up on some of my favorite booktubers lists, I couldn't help myself. So the first one was featured on Books and Lala's and Plant-Based Brides favorites videos of 2023, and that is Natural Beauty by Ling Huang. And I honestly don't know a lot about this other than the fact that a lot of people have been comparing it to Rouge, but saying that this is a better version of that. It uses body horror to critique and explore some topics around consumerism and the beauty industry. The next horror book was again recommended by two of my favorite channels, Lily Reads and Tammy Tries to Read. And I'll be honest, similarly to The Very Nice Box, I think it was the cover that kind of tipped me over the edge. It's so beautiful. That is Chlorine by Jade. We're finally reading it. Look at it. It's so pretty. This sounds like it's going to be a coming of age horror novel about a girl who is convinced she's actually a mermaid. I'm sold, I can't wait. And we've got just one more book, and it is actually a non-fiction title. It was a book that I was vaguely interested in, but I'd never read anything from the author before. So it was when the Poptimist did a dedicated review recently around favorites time that just convinced me I needed to pick it up and give it a go. And that is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. I'll leave the Poptimist review in the description box below, along with links to all of the channels I'm referencing. Naomi Klein is obviously somebody that I have heard of before, I know of, but like I said, I've never read anything from her before. But one of the reasons that I was particularly interested in this is because it's about her experience being confused for Naomi Wolf. Naomi Wolf was obviously quite a prominent feminist in like the 80s and 90s, and in fact The Beauty Myth was the first feminist text I ever read. Obviously that book was written a long time ago. I have grown as a feminist. Naomi Wolf has changed a lot, and especially in the last few years she has dived right off the deep end into alt-right conspiracy theory stuff. So I don't know that this is necessarily going to be the quickest or easiest read, but I definitely am very interested. So with all that said, that is the TBR for this video. I'm so excited, and all that's left to do is to get to reading. I'm just realizing this shirt almost matches this book. Normally I do those sort of things intentionally, not this time. So I have finished Aboreality by Rebecca Campbell, which is a very short novella / connected short story collection kind of thing, which was very enthusiastically recommended a couple of times last year by Angela over at Literature Science Alliance. And I can definitely see why. There is so much to like about this book, and it's one of those books that felt like it packed in so much more than could possibly have been included in just 112 pages. So as I said, it's kind of like a collection of interconnected short stories, and it's climate fiction. It's kind of set over, I think, sort of like the next 80 years or so, basically over the course of this century. As climate change, especially we see around floods, extreme temperatures and fires, as well as pandemics, have just completely altered their way of life. The first story starts out with some people basically trying to rescue books from a library, which kind of sounded like it might have been set around 2020 maybe, or perhaps slightly further in the future. It's one of those stories that while yes, it is climate fiction, it is science fiction, you could even describe it as dystopian perhaps. It's not dramatic or action-packed. Instead, the focus for this book is very much on just like the everyday mundane reality of these different people and their existence in this time and place. Almost like there's a level of acceptance at what's happening, and they're just doing what they need to do to get by and to survive and to adapt. Some of the writing was just beautiful, especially around like the relationship with the land that the people have. And I loved especially how we saw that change over time, and particularly over generations. I will say that as much as I really wanted to fall in love with this book, I didn't love it as much as Angela did, despite me really trying. There was just a lot of characters for such a short book, and it almost felt like sometimes these short stories were almost cluttered with too many characters and too many people that I didn't have enough time to get to know as people. I honestly barely had enough time to figure out who was who half the time. The dialogue felt very clunky, and like there were so many M dashes in this book, oh my god. I get that a dash and M dash can be useful in writing, but when you're using M dashes instead of commas a lot of the time, like to me that just kind of starts to break up the narrative, and otherwise the language was so beautiful and flowing. So I personally just didn't like that style choice. But then with the dialogue itself, there's so often when characters will just kind of like cut each other off, or they won't finish a sentence, but it just felt overused, and sometimes it just meant that I didn't really know who was talking or what they were saying or what they were trying to say. So I suppose my point is that I really liked the bones of this. I liked the interaction that we got between the people and the land, and watching how that relationship evolved over time. I love the overall project of this book so much. I love the way that it felt really kind of horrific and terrifying and tragic and dark, but it equally felt beautiful and tender and hopeful in a way too. Not hopeful in a way that our society will survive intact and everything will be fine, but hopeful in the way that the world endures and people endure. And as long as humanity endures, a love for beauty and connection and relationships and romance and music and books will endure too. And even though I would not describe this as a book that I loved, I very much appreciate the time that I did spend with it, and I'm really glad to have read it. While I was reading, in some ways this book kind of reminds me of if you crossed Sea of Tranquility, which obviously is another kind of like subtle literary sci-fi. It also deals with pandemic and just like the world changing and our experience of each other changing. If you cross that with The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valente, obviously that has quite a bleak outlook on planet Earth itself and what remains after the climate collapse. But there was something about the tone in particular in that book that reminded me of this, the way that it captured both kind of the horror of the future that it's presenting, but also the beauty of it too. The way that the message of hope in these books was not compromised by simply downplaying the severity of the future and potentially what we're looking at, but equally there's a hope almost in the act of endurance itself. And also there was like a passage in here at one point where one of the characters is reflecting on sort of like resenting the past and people like us existing now in the kind of lavish lifestyles that a lot of us have by comparison. And that reminded me a lot of Tetley. in The Past Is Red. So while I loved both of those books a lot more than I loved this one, I still just really enjoyed reading it. I liked the project and I'm glad to have read it. So thank you so much, Angela. Now, on to our next book. What are we going to read next, Ollie? So we have a little bit of catching up to do because I have finished 2 books. Let's start with Lud-In-The-Mist by Mirrlees. I know that this is just a print-on-demand copy, but there's something about this cover that I really like. It's very pretty, very ethereal, very misty, very appropriate. So as we mentioned, this is a pre-Tolkien fantasy story set in Lud, which is like the town, and I guess that makes the people who live there Luddites. So this was published in the 1920s, and it feels like a classic. I mean, it's still within the last 100 years, so it's not like old-timey, but it definitely has a certain quality to it that makes it feel very much like it's not written now, if you know what I mean. Essentially, we're introduced to some of the people that live in Lud, this city that kind of borders fairyland. And essentially everything about fairyland, the people of Lud kind of fear and detest, and it's very taboo. So they don't talk about fairy, they don't talk about magic, they don't talk about anything to do with fairyland, and in fact, it's considered almost like offensive to do so. And we're introduced to a few people, one of whom is Nathaniel Chanticleer, and like a lot of the people that we get to know and that we follow are quite high up in like political positions. There is in fact quite a lot of like political machinations going on. That's a big part of the book. Anyway, despite the people of Lud and people like Nathaniel Chanticleer's leadership and their best efforts, things are crossing the border from fairyland. In particular, one thing they're especially concerned about is fairy fruit, which almost seems like some kind of drug in this world, and there's like a lot of moral panic around it, and it definitely has some peculiar kind of symptoms that come along with eating it. And so despite all of the rules and the taboos keeping fairyland not only out of sight but out of mind, like literally not even talking about it, fairy fruit is becoming a little bit of a problem in Lud, and that's kind of like where our story takes off. So like I said, a lot of this book really is about like the political machinations and different relationships between different families and houses. A lot of it is also about this culture of kind of secrecy and denial in Lud itself. There's also like this historical murder mystery that gets brought into the present day plot. Like there's surprisingly an awful lot going on here. And I found it interesting almost as like a curiosity to kind of see like a fantasy story before fantasy kind of became what we know it today. In so many ways, this feels a bit more like a fairy tale. And while there is kind of like this whole underbelly plot thing happening with murder mysteries and like the dead and the fae and all of this sort of stuff, it does all feel quite whimsical too. And there was just some really, really beautiful moments with the writing too that I really liked. And so while there is a lot to appreciate about this, I think for me as a reader, I liked this more as like a curiosity rather than a book itself. I wasn't really in it, and I don't know whether that is partly because I did listen to the audiobook along with reading, and now looking back on it, I'm not so sure I loved the audiobook. I don't think it really worked for me. I think if I were to reread this in future, I would just read it physically. I think I might prefer that. There was something about the delivery and some of the accents and stuff that I just found a little grating. Obviously, I'm not somebody who reads a huge amount of fantasy historically, but like I'm reading more and more recently, and I just feel like I've like peeked behind the curtain a little bit and had a little bit of a peek at like the bones of what so much of fantasy is today. And while I would describe this as quaint in a lot of ways, it's like less quaint and cutesy and twee, I think, than I was expecting. Like quite a lot of this is pretty gritty in a lot of ways. I mean, there's basically a drug trafficking plot. I think my favorite moments were honestly just some of the really beautiful language around like more existential topics and some of the themes that the book was exploring. For example, and I won't give any context to this quote because it is about halfway through, but some characters are basically talking about how, you know, life is challenging and complex. And one character says, "There's no clock like the sun and no calendar like the stars." And why? Because it gets one used to the look of time. There's no bogey from over the hills that scares one like time. But when one's been used all one's life to seeing him naked, as it were, instead of shut up in a clock, like he is in Lud, one learns that he is as quiet and peaceful as an old ox dragging the plough. And to watch time teaches one to sing. There were moments like that that I just adored, but I think overall I never really found myself sinking into the whole experience of it and getting swept away with the plot, despite it being relatively complex and a lot going on. There was even one moment where there was a reveal that made me gasp out loud. So I definitely enjoyed this, and I do feel glad to have read it, but I can't say that I liked it quite as much as Leanna did. The other book we have to talk about though is M is for Monster by Talia Dutton, and this is the graphic novel of the video, and I really like liked this. It's kind of a bit of a Frankenstein retelling, but almost in a way that it could be read as a bit of an allegory for queerness or for a variety of other experiences too. Our main character's name is M, and we literally start, the opening scene is M being brought to life in a science lab. And we find out pretty quickly that basically what's happening is Frances, this character, her sister died not too long ago. They were very, very close, and basically Frances is trying to bring her sister back to life. This is her sister's body. Frances is kind of like this mad scientist kind of character, and she's driven by grief. And her experiment kind of works in the sense that she has reanimated this body, but it has failed because this body is not her sister. And essentially what unfolds is M, the name that this character gives herself, wanting to live. And yet Frances is basically so obsessed with the idea of bringing her sister back that she's convinced that if the memories haven't come back, then she just has to try again. And so M sort of goes through this period of like trying to become her sister and trying to act like her sister and talk like her sister. But at the end of the day, that's not who she is. So she's both scared of rejection, but she's also literally scared for her life. And so essentially it's this Frankenstein sci-fi story that at the heart of it is about the drive that we have to be true to ourselves and the need that we have to be able to express our identity authentically, whatever that identity is, even if and especially when the people around us are rejecting that identity for whatever reason. So obviously with graphic novels like this, it was a very quick read. I really liked the artwork and I liked the smallness of this story. There are a handful of side characters, but it doesn't kind of get carried away with trying to build out a big cast. The focus really is on M and the secondary focus on Frances. And although it's not like first person or anything, our perspective mainly does focus on M, and I really liked the intimacy that we had with her and how it was her experience of needing to be able to be herself when Frances wasn't accepting that, wasn't allowing that, wasn't making that safe for M. Our perspective was focused on M's experience, and I thought that that was just so powerful. Like, as readers, we had sympathy for the fact that Frances was experiencing grief and how desperate she was to bring her sister back. But at the end of the day, how she's acting is so harmful, and more or less she's the villain of the story. So I really like the way that this book used like horror elements and horror kind of details with, you know, this creature being brought back from the dead a la Frankenstein. But it's not really a horror story. Instead, it's a really tender exploration of identity and family and love. And it was honestly just really kind of beautiful. So we're another 2 down, but there is still plenty of reading to get on with. So I'm gonna get stuck right in and I'll talk to you soon. Do you like my little teacups? They were my granny's. She had a whole, I think she called it like a crazy set, where it was like a whole set of teacups and saucers, but they were all different colors. When she passed away, I picked 2 of my favorites, and obviously I'm gonna keep them forever. They're so cute. Looks like Ollie will be joining us because she keeps trying to get me to play with her, and her little feet pitter-pattering all over the floor is not conducive to a video. Can you give me like 5 minutes to talk about a book and then we'll play? Okay, so where were we? I finished the very nice box, and I have to be honest with you, I have gone through a range of emotions with this book, and I actually went back and watched Sunny's original reading vlog where she first read this. It was like a year old, and I feel like she had a similar kind of roller coaster experience. And that is because there is a lot to like about this, but there is also some very intentional unlikable elements. And also this book starts out as kind of just like this quite mellow, like slice of life satire, and it turns into something quite different by the end. In this book, we're introduced to our main character named Ava, who is like a product engineer at Starter, which is like essentially a stand-in for IKEA. And the big project that she is working on currently perfecting is her passion project, the very nice box. She's somebody who very much lives by routine, and she's very dedicated and focused on her work, almost to the exclusion of all else. That is until one day the boss that she's always worked for and she respects steps down, and instead there's a new kid on the block. His name's Matt. He's a little bit younger than Ava is, and he's already immediately talking some very like pop psychology, millennial kind of like Silicon Valley language. In so many ways, Matt is just everything that Ava hates. But through a series of events, they end up spending some time together and getting closer. And this is a big deal for Ava. Not only is she kind of like changing up her routine a little bit and things are changing in her life for the first time in quite a while, it's also a big deal because we find out that in the not too distant past, Ava has experienced some very significant tragedy, which led her to really close herself off in almost every way that you can think of to protect herself. So I don't know how much to say about this book because, like I said, there definitely is a big change in how the book feels at the beginning to how it feels at the end. But for so much of this book, it's essentially, it feels like a satire on that Silicon Valley millennial corporate culture with a bit of like the pop psychology bullshit thrown into. One of the things that I really liked about the book, and it was so mundane, but because of the way that it was used, it felt absurd, was how starter products are everywhere in this book. And the most mundane household items are always starter products. And so they're always described by their proper noun. And that's one of the ways that this whole starter corporation does feel like it's just like weaved into every element of Ava's life. And this whole starter office environment and culture, especially now with Matt introduced, does just feel kind of culty. So all of that I've just said is really just the first part of the book. The middle part of the book turns into a romance. The final third of the book, especially I'd say like the last 60 pages, almost becomes this like thriller kind of situation, but it still holds on to the absurdity and the wit and just like the subtle humor all the way through. So for like the first half of this book, I was obsessed. I was like, oh my God, this could be a new favorite book for me. I can't put it down. And it was hugely readable, which is something I feel like has been a little bit lacking in my reading lately. So I very much appreciated it just for that alone. I was having such a good time. I love me some good satire. Then in like the third quarter, I did feel like it was starting to drag quite a bit. And then how it all ended, it was thrilling and weird, but it was almost not thrilling and weird enough. But at the same time, it was bonkers. There were definitely elements of the book that I just loved, but I'm left kind of not feeling whether it should be a 5-star or a 3-star. And like a 4-star doesn't feel quite right either. Do you know what I mean? Like that's how I feel about this book. It just was a bit of a weird experience. And so in that way, reading this book almost reminded me of reading Temporary by Hilary Lecter. And in fact, I think Hilary Lecter is she's one of the authors who has blurbed the book. This was one of my favorite books of a couple of years ago. When I first read it, I was like, what the hell was that? It's satire on like late stage capitalism that we find ourselves in and the nature of work. And I think I gave it around a 4-star when I first read it, but I did not stop thinking about it. And by the end of the year, it ended up on, my top 10 favorites list. I love it. And I do feel like this book did a better job of kind of, like taking the satire to the nth degree, really committing to the bit sort of thing. This book was not quite as weird as I remember Temporary being. But a lot of the reasons that I like Temporary are the reasons that I liked this one so much too. Some of the comp titles that are offered in the blurb here are Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, which is a book I hated. And then the other comp title is Severance, which is a book I have not read. And even though I hated Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, I do understand where that comp is coming from. It's kind of almost if you took Eleanor Oliphant and put her in a bit of like a weird satire like Temporary. Some of the other books though that it kind of reminded me of was The Convenience Store Woman and There Is No Such Thing as an Easy Job. I think the way that both of these books are exploring millennial experience in like capitalism in our moment right now in workplaces, the way that work is such a big part of our experiences and our identities and how it so easily kind of consumes everything. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's hints of all of these books with a sprinkle of Eleanor Oliphant in the very nice box. I really liked the exploration of grief and trauma, even though that wasn't the entirety of the story. So much of it is also about capitalism and power dynamics and authority and workplace culture. And I think this book does a great job of highlighting the way that we are so compartmentalized and individualized under capitalism and in workplace cultures, especially corporate culture. And also the way in which workers are so often required to compartmentalize themselves and their own experiences to perform at work, which I think is captured very nicely by the concept of the very nice box that Ava is working on throughout the book. It was a good time. It was thought-provoking, but it was still fun, but it also had emotional impact. Also, I will never get over this cover. I loved it before I read it, but now having read it, I love it even more. Every single little detail. It's perfect. But you have been so patient. You ready to go play now? Yeah, you want to play? Come on, let's go play. So I've brought Ollie and I'm wearing my brand new, very fun t-shirt to hopefully kind of distract you from the potentially terrible opinions I'm about to share with you. I read, or tried to read, our 2 horror books. I started with Natural Beauty and This was a slog and I didn't like it. It's a book exploring beauty standards, especially Western and white beauty standards, and it's kind of satire mixed with horror, especially body horror. Our main character remains unnamed throughout the book, but there's a handful of things that we know about her. We know she's Asian American and we know that she is struggling financially a lot. She did not grow up wealthy at all, but on top of that, she's struggling to support herself while also trying to support her unwell parents. We meet her at the beginning of the book when she's struggling financially, working at this kind of like burger joint or something, just getting by the best that she can, when a clearly very wealthy woman waltzes in and offers her a job at a place called Holistic. This place almost gives Goop kind of vibes, you know, like a little bit culty, but offering products and procedures around beauty and wellness to the elite. But even with this new proximity to privilege and the kind of strange sense of belonging that is offered at Holistic, her money troubles persist. And so she is offered opportunities to essentially participate in some more extreme branches of the company, and shit just kind of unravels from there. So I really like the concept, and I like a lot of what this book is doing. I really like a lot of the themes around identity and sense of self and connection to culture, how race and class intermingle with white privilege and white beauty standards, and of course the big topic of consumerism and the privilege that uber wealthy people have. I don't quite know how to put this, but I suppose the best thing that I can say is that the further along in the book we got, the more exaggerated some of the stuff that was happening at Holistic got, to the point where some of it was honestly just a little bit ridiculous. And while I think this exaggeration was supposed to heighten the horror, it instead had the opposite effect for me. I want to give one example, and I won't give any context around it, but if you're spoiler sensitive, I'll put a little spoiler text here, so skip forward. At one point towards the end of the book, people are basically getting artificially inseminated with some weird stuff. But it's done using like this big silver mechanism machine thing that like kind of takes up the whole room and is like overhead. And I get that this is supposed to be like horrific, like this big kind of technological, creepy, terrifying thing happening. But to me, it just didn't make any sense why they were using this kind of massive machinery to perform something like that at all, when like artificial insemination is currently done and is so much easier to do just like mechanically, you know, like with hands and tubes and shit. So that's just one example that I'll give of this kind of exaggeration of what was happening that I think was supposed to be scarier, but I think something more realistic and closer to reality would have scared me more. Instead of taking me out of the scene and being like, what the fuck is going on? I would have been like, oh my God, that is horrifying. I don't know if that makes sense. It's definitely a subjective thing. Your mileage may vary, but that was just my experience. Which did get me thinking and wondering if like maybe I just don't like horror. Like I was kind of hoping this would open the door for me, really getting to enjoy and explore a new genre. But because I just wasn't enjoying the overall reading experience, even though I liked a lot of what the book was saying, I liked the writing, I just didn't like reading it. I did just start wondering, maybe horror isn't for me. Which is why after finishing that book, I dove straight into Chlorine. This book, I liked even less. I didn't even finish it. I DNF'd around 85 pages. But overall, where I could appreciate natural beauty, what it was doing, I liked the writing. This book, I know that reading is subjective and I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, but I just could not get over, at least from my own personal opinion, how bad this writing was. It just felt so juvenile and clunky, and honestly, I kept feeling like I would have read something like a lot of the language that is used in this on Tumblr in 2014. It had like those fan fiction kind of like melodramatic vibes. I haven't even told you what this book is about, or at least the first 85 pages are about. At the beginning, we meet a girl named Ren who is obsessed with the idea of mermaids from a very young age and like the freedom and power that they represent to her, to the point where she is convinced that she is a mermaid. Like she just needs to be born into her true self. And so she spends her early childhood trying to convince her mother to allow her to join the swim team, so that she can finally like be in water, be swimming where she feels like she belongs. And when she does this, it turns out she has a raw natural talent for swimming. And so from there, we kind of jump forward a couple of years to when she's 13 and she first gets her period, and kind of like what life is like as like a budding athlete and pro swimmer, the competitiveness of it all, but also like the experience of her female body being observed and changing and puberty and all of that sort of stuff. So again, some very interesting, cool themes that I was really looking forward to. But like I said, the writing absolutely abysmal as far as I'm concerned. And then on top of that, there were parts of the characterization that just felt so unthoughtful and inconsistent. And I suppose I'll just tell you about one part that was one of the many examples that I just was like, What the fuck am I reading? It was on page 28, so it's very early on in the book. It's when our main character, Ren, has just gotten her period for the first time. And her mum and her spend like 5 or 7 hours or something trying to insert a tampon. And I totally get that getting our period for the first time, going through puberty in general, is honestly kind of a really messy, horrific, weird time for so many of us. And I do feel like those changes of puberty is like prime opportunity for some really cool metaphor and exploration within horror. But this was just ridiculous. Like hours trying to insert a tampon. Like I absolutely get that there are conditions that might make insertion of a tampon challenging or even impossible. But after a few hours trying, don't you kind of figure that potentially there's something else going on and like either, I don't know, go get checked out by a doctor or try something else? I don't know, it was just utterly absurd. And then just to top it all off, and this is all within the same scene, she says, "I was furious. I was forced to push a cardboard and cotton tube into my vagina before a dick or a finger. Pain before pleasure." I'm sorry, but what 13-year-old thinks that? What 13-year-old thinks that? Like I said, that just feels like angry feminist Tumblr stuff. I don't know how else to put it. It feels like something a 19-year-old would write about their 13-year-old self to try and like make the whole experience sound a lot more edgy than it was. Now, potentially if I had not just read this, I might have had the stomach to try and push through with this one. But equally, I do feel like this is just a much better book in almost every way, especially when it comes to the writing and characterizations. I suppose it just felt like to me that this was the kind of book that is written just to shock, not necessarily to be thought-provoking or to evoke emotion, but just to shock. And I'm just not interested in that. So how are we feeling after that rant? Did my cute shirt and cute dog tactic work? Probably not, let's be real. The good news is that I have saved what I think will be the best book for last. So I'm gonna get to reading. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you rather than ranting at you in our next clip. Fingers crossed. So I was right. I am definitely enjoying Doppelganger a lot more than I enjoyed our horror books, but I'm enjoying it so much that I am reading this quite slowly. I'm actually only halfway through, and I think if this were almost any other book, I would either find a way to cut it out of the video entirely, or I would just push this video back until I had finished. But firstly, this is a non-fiction, so obviously that means that there is not some plot where I need to get to the end to find out what happens. But secondly, this book is doing so much that I feel like I could already talk to you for so long about everything that I've read in the first half. And I know it never picks up very well because I put my tabs on like the inside of the pages, so you can just kind of like see the edges. But I have been tabbing the absolute loving shit out of this book. And I'm not usually somebody who does this. So as we mentioned at the beginning, the kind of instigating event for Naomi Klein writing this book was an increase in her being confused for Naomi Wolf. And as we spoke about at the beginning, Naomi Wolf, especially these days, is somebody with a very different political value system to Naomi Klein. And so in this book, she's kind of exploring that concept of doppelganger, of a double, of a mirror image of ourselves. But I think she does an exceptional job of using this personal experience and kind of like extrapolating it to a larger public discourse and using it as a lens through which to explore a lot of the cultural and political challenges that we're all kind of like in the midst of right now. And while she definitely does allow space for historical context, primarily this is focused on 2020 to now. She talks about what she thinks is kind of Naomi Wolf's origin story as far as her going to the dark side. And while she does spend plenty of this book critiquing and challenging a bunch of things that Naomi Wolf has said, especially in the last few years, she also is very intentional about trying to take opportunities to view Naomi Wolf as a mirror. And so while she's kind of comparing and contrasting her own worldview with that of Naomi Wolf, she's also comparing and contrasting progressive and leftist culture and dialogue with what she calls the mirror world. And I suppose that is what a lot of us would call the alt-right and its adjacent ideologies. It's not necessarily conservatism, it's not necessarily what we think of as traditional right-wing. It's the bubble that is Steve Bannon, Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Donald Trump, Posey Parker, Jordan Peterson, Christiane Northrup, all of that kind of messy stuff. And so some of my favorite parts of the book so far have been Naomi Klein's analysis of some of the language that this space, this mirror world, uses, which so often is language that has either been co-opted or just slightly adjusted from what has traditionally been seen as leftist language. I've also really appreciated a lot of the discussion around how leftists and progressives have been essentially ceding territory to the mirror world. That is, topics that are traditionally kind of like our forte, we've kind of, especially since the pandemic, as a collective, let slip into the mirror world, and they have become pillars of what is now far-right, alt-right ideology, just with a conspiratorial, often supremacist spin. Like I said, this book covers so much ground. Already, just in the first half, we've explored things around Nazis, eugenics, New Age conspirituality. There's been a lot of exploration about Naomi Wolf and her relationship with Steve Bannon and the role that Steve Bannon has played, particularly in shaping American discourse in the last few years. It's also about how, I suppose, that age-old comment on the left, like how we like to eat our own. I think in this book, Naomi Klein is exploring how that is not only continuing to make us less effective, but it's also opened up this space for people who are willing to present a completely different reality to serve their own purposes. So essentially, Naomi Klein is seeking to understand but also challenge so much of the ideology of the mirror world, while also taking this opportunity to like reflect that mirror back onto herself and to the left, to see where we are and have been limiting ourselves, limiting our movements, and maybe failing. I also really like the conversation around how, like, essentially when the mirror world catches on to a subject, for example, vaccines or health mandates, it's like liberals, progressives, and leftists almost don't want to touch that topic because it's been tainted, because to engage with that conversation was kind of tricky and made a lot more complicated by all of the conspiracy stuff that was happening over in the mirror world. So all of that is not to say that I necessarily agree with all of Naomi's arguments or her conclusions, but I am just really enjoying reading this. So I know it's kind of unusual to finish a reading vlog without having finished the book, but I don't want to rush this one. I mean, I've been reading this book for about a week already, and I don't think I'm going to speed up anytime soon. I'm just really enjoying spending time here and just getting an opportunity to think about some of the topics that she's raising through this lens of doppelgangers and the mirror world. And I will update you on my final thoughts in my March reading wrap up. So if you want to stick around for that in a few weeks' time, make sure you're subscribed. Before we finish up though, I did want to talk a little bit more about these two books, which were obviously my least two favorite of the video. And while I always want to be honest with you about how I feel, even if I really, really don't like a book, I hope it is always clear that I am very much aware that it's an opinions thing, right? And if you loved this book, more power to you. And even though I didn't like either of these books, I didn't even finish this one, I have found myself kind of thinking about them a little bit since I did read them. I think especially the fact that these two books, that I read them together, and there are a lot of similarities, but they're also so different. The main characters in each of these books are Asian women, and there's some queer themes as well. Both of them are exploring different topics under the kind of overarching umbrella of feminism, especially around identity and autonomy and freedom. But at the same time, they're kind of going about those two things in very different ways. I feel like at the end of the day, this is a book ultimately commenting on assimilation and the dangers and harms of assimilation. Whereas this book is about a character who just absolutely will not assimilate. So I kind of like that I did get to read these books together. I appreciate that juxtaposition. I suppose at the end of the day, I'm just kind of left feeling like maybe horror isn't quite for me. And the other thing I think I've learned in this video is that maybe satire is more where I need to head. I think when I was kind of interested in reading more horror, I just heard so many people talking about those books that we read together, along with things like Lone Woman and The Reformatory, all of which just sound so thematically rich. And we know how I love some juicy, rich themes. I think what I'm more looking for is satire, because we still get to explore those themes. We still get a bit of the exaggeration, the absurdity, but just through a little bit of a different lens. So I hope you enjoyed this second installment of this kind of like mini series reading books that booktubers have mentioned in their favorites videos. If you missed the first video I did in this series, you can check that out here. And coming up in the not too distant future will be part 3, me reading books that booktubers said were their least favorite books of 2023. So stay tuned for that. As always, a big thank you goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching. Until next time, happy reading. Bye.